All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to what is this, day 5, day 6? You guys are still going strong, looking good, staying clean. So my name is Charles Shaw, and I'm an author and a filmmaker from America. Don't hold it against me. I deal primarily in social justice issues and cultural analysis. I wrote a book called Exile Nation, which is part memoir, part investigative reporting into the various paradigms that I frame under the war on consciousness, which we're going to be talking about now. But specifically, my book deals with my experience as a drug addict and then a drug law reform activist and then a drug war prisoner. And it follows most of my experience through the prison system in the United States, and talks a lot about different emergent communities and subcultures and the kind of repressive forces that are against them. So that's what I'm kind of framing this talk around. I'm calling it the War on Consciousness and the festival community. It's also been known as the War on Consciousness in the psychedelic community. The reason I'm not calling it the psychedelic community here, which kind of is a great lead-in for my talk, is that when I was booked here, the promoters of the event, who I know and who are really good people, they were very excited to have me here, but they had to inform me that they couldn't advertise my talk. They couldn't promote me with the rest of the speakers because they were afraid that just by what I was saying, I was going to bring unwarranted police attention to the festival. Right? Which is both flattering and a little bit infuriating, if you look at it. And the reason so is because I talk about these things that people, both within and outside the culture, don't necessarily want to talk about a lot. And so here's my philosophy. We have this incredible community of people, this incredible culture, this global culture that is based in this kind of festival scene. It's like our little autonomous zones. We're able to kind of come here and create and be and do. And they're kind of like on the fringes of civilization. They're kind of pushed. Come on, like we are 3 hours from the nearest town here. We are sharing the space with crocodiles. And most of the other things have been run out of here a little earlier. Burning Man is in the middle of the most godforsaken desert on the planet that no rational human being would ever go into for any other reason except to have a free space to create and to explore in all different forms. And I'm also an event producer, a festival producer. I spend a lot of time going around the world, seeing other events, seeing other systems, and more and more I'm starting to understand that this is a kind of community that is both on the verge of extraordinary things, but also are facing a kind of a massive backlash that's in many ways been going on for a long time, and that's the kind of substance that I'm going to get into in my talk. So I guess I want to open this by kind of telling a little story. And it took place last week at Entheon Gaia, which is another gathering down in the jungle, a few hours from here. And so they had this opening ceremony on the first day, and everybody went up to this beautiful little native ceremony and put on their white and burned their shit and danced and said their prayers, and they all left and they started coming down the hill. And all of a sudden everyone's running around pointing like this up in the sky, and I'm just kind of having my coffee, getting up. I didn't really go to the ceremony, sitting in a chair. And they're like, "Look, Charles, look!" And they point up in the sky. And there's a big coronal ring around the sun, right? And they're like, "Look, our focused intention has brought us a sign from the universe that we are aligned. Isn't it beautiful?" And me and a couple of friends get up and we go out and we look and we go, "Oh wow, they've been spraying this morning, haven't they?" And there's a huge layer of chemtrail spray up there, and the sun was refracting through it and creating that very typical kind of mirrored flowy pattern that the aerosol spray creates in the sky, right? So Me and my friends are like, oh yeah, no, that's just spray. And, oh boy, I never thought I was going to get eviscerated by a bunch of hippie women faster in my life. And they all looked at me like, what are you talking about? How could you steal this from us? You know, what do you mean? Dark energy, boom, 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 and there's all this. And I was like, no, it just is what it is. Like, you see this your way. You know, we're both looking at the same thing. And you choose to see it as a positive sign of empowerment and, you know, freedom and intention. And some of us look at it and say, oh no, that's something entirely different. Somewhat typifies this community. And I can spend all year and going around to these festivals. I can spend all week sitting in the speaker zone, and you will get more sunshine blown up your ass than you could ever imagine. Everything's perfect, everything's wonderful, yada yada yada. The world is just the way it meant to be, the universe is just perfect. You know, I hear a lot of this stuff everywhere I go. Don't be afraid, don't worry, don't do this. And I'm not giving a message to say be afraid of anything. What I'm saying is, like, be conscious of what's going on. Because being part of a consciousness movement is about expanding your consciousness in all forms. It doesn't just mean picking the things that make you feel good, right? So with that being said, I kind of have felt, since I have had a different experience than many people I meet in this culture, because I came from a very rough background. I spent 10 years as a crack addict. I spent time in prison. I spent time in the streets as a radical activist, fighting the system head on, you know. Real brilliant idea that was. And so I've kind of seen multiple perspectives on all of this. And I've never really found a summation of it that is better than this. This is by a writer named Kingsley Dennis. It's from a book called Between Both Worlds, Thoughts and Ideas That Reflect the Concerns of Our Conscious Evolution. And Kingsley Dennis, yeah, really good writer, really good book. I'm going to share with you an opening quote. He says, for long periods of human history, there has been active forces penetrating our world that seek to keep humanity asleep and distracted from themselves. Also that these forces are aware of the true power of human consciousness, and that the social power structures used to influence and manipulate the masses would collapse if true human potential were to be exercised. Therefore, in the pursuit of control and power, certain forces active upon the earth aim to artificially suppress the natural evolution of human consciousness. Humanity is caught in a struggle, and our consciousness is the battleground. It may come as unnerving news to some to hear that humanity is constantly being bombarded by forces and events that are beyond our control. This does not make us impotent, however. All natural organisms are under the influence of external forces. Yet with humanity, there are also other forces at work. These forces are deliberate, more often than not man-made, and manipulate with intent. They aim to persuade if possible and coerce if necessary. It is these forces that seek to target the remaining spaces where humanity has a modicum of free choice and free will. Think about where you're sitting right now. To some degree, these forces are part of the requirements of civilization to shepherd and organize a burgeoning population. Yet, over and above, there exist exploitative forces that work against the laws of conscious evolution. It is these forces, and the need to overcome them, that form a core theme of our times. The perpetual battlefield is what we know as our everyday lives. Our education, our work, our leisure, our emotional and spiritual well-being, and our conscious thinking. Yet the armaments of this struggle are not guns, tanks, airplanes, bombs, or battle cruisers. It is much more subtle than this. It is less hardware and more software. It is, in effect, a very silent war. And it is a war which is even more important than the tragic physical scourges occurring on our beautiful planet today. It is a war that targets not only the present, but also the very long-term future or potential futures of civilization. And it has been going on for as long as humankind has existed on planet Earth. What is this war? It is a battle for our minds, how we think. In short, it is the war of consciousness. Now, there are lots of different ways that we could go at this issue. And we can go all the way down the rabbit hole if you want and talk about some seriously far out there shit. But I prefer to look at it and ground it in a more sober historical analysis, right? And so the basic principle operating here is that any time throughout history that there has been a population, a subculture, a group within a society that has been oppressed or that has been constrained or that has been repressed, that they eventually come to this moment of emergent consciousness. They come to the point where they realize that they, if you want to use the Matrix analogy, that's one really great metaphor to use, you know, where they finally see through the illusion and they realize that they have in effect been slaves. And now our civilization in and of itself, the concept of civilization, which is represented by the pyramid, right, with the all-seeing eye at the top, that is the way that society has been structured for 15,000 years. It came out of Sumeria, went into Babylonia, went into Egypt, went into Rome, went to the British Empire, went to the American Empire. It's one straight lineage called civilization. It's broken into three classes. There's the elite, the middles, and the low, the masses. The high, middle, and the low. Orwell writes about this very eloquently. And throughout civilized history, right, it's been this constant battle between the high and the middle fighting over who's going to be on top, right? And then they usually kind of enlist the services of the lower classes, promising them equality and utopia. And then once they do all the fighting, then the middle becomes the new high, and the high gets forced down to the middle. Then they force the low back down into their place, and everything starts all over again. And then over and over and over and over it happens. So there's a very small, very powerful ruling class that controls almost everything on this planet. And they used to hide behind monarchies and then colonial empires, and now they're hiding behind corporations and banks, but they're the same people, and they've been there all along. And one thing they don't really like is change. And what Kingsley Dennis is talking about in this book here, and the thing that can't be stopped is change, is evolution. You know, we are evolving beings, right? But every time there has been a kind of movement towards freedom, there has been a huge repressive backlash against it. And we can look throughout time at these examples. You know, empires switched their theistic principles, you know, monotheism, polytheism, you know, these gods from this area, this god from this area, for political reasons, right? You know, Constantine turned the Roman Empire Christian because he realized that it was the only way to hold it together. Because, you know, the dissension against the Roman Empire was growing too great. That's why they had to get the fuck out of Rome and go to Byzantium. You know, you look at the Pilgrims, you know, the Puritans that left England and founded, you know, America. You know, if you buy that whole story, you know, they were persecuted because of their beliefs. You look at the Mormons. The Mormons are persecuted because of their beliefs. They're run out of their area. Pagans were hunted down and burned at the stake for years, and tortured during the Inquisitions and during the transitions to Christianity. And they were wiped out because they were a threat to the new order, and that they held wisdom from ancient times of things like our connection to this planet and our connections to the stars and everything like that. And in the kind of Christian empire's desire to control everything, they grabbed up all of the information that they could, and anybody that was living against that or living by those principles, they wiped them out. Jews have had to deal with this throughout history, particularly in Europe, when they have been, each successive empire has like forced them into a new place. You know, when the Inquisition came into Portugal and Spain, it pushed all of the Jews up north into, you know, Holland and Belgium and France, and there most of the Dutch Empire was built. You know, it's like a constant shifting or migration of people. We can look in the United States. You know, one of the great examples I like to talk about is what happened to the African American population throughout the Civil Rights Movement. Now, it's a very interesting and unique idea, because what you have with the United States of America is like a brutal imperial power that conquered an entire continent by wiping out the indigenous species and then replacing it with another slave species. You know, we have that in common with Brazil. You know, came and conquered, killed the indigenous, and brought black slaves. So we had like double the problems. So the United States hasn't ever acknowledged the genocide that it committed against its own native inhabitants. And I have my sister, Soraya, is full-blood Ojibwa. And her father was Chippewa and her mother was in Ottawa. And the Ojibwa Nation kind of crossed the northern American, southern Canadian border. Her people are completely gone. There's no reservation, there's no nation, there's no organized structure, they're just gone. They live in a kind of, what of them are left are extremely poor. When my sister was born, her parents were both migrant fish cannery workers in the Great Lakes when they used to have a big fishing industry there before the industry killed all the fish. And, you know, they would travel around looking for places to work. You know, we like to paint this portrait of Native Americans being this like very regal and majestic species of, you know, human in the United States, and that's just kind of like that great American media machine pumping out more images to make you feel good. But like in the reality, like drug addiction, alcoholism, infant mortality, poverty are the highest in the Native American population than anywhere else in the continent, on a huge factor. And so what they did was, like, you know, made all these promises, crunched all these people into reservations, and now one at a time they've kicked them all off the reservations claiming eminent domain, and oh, we found minerals, by the way, so we're going to take these now, and here you just go and live on this, you know, piece of sand over here. But with the slave population that they brought from Africa, you know, there was 100-odd years that the American empire was built on the backs of these slaves. And the economy was a slave-driven economy. By the way, all civilizations have slave-driven economies. We have them today. We just call them sweatshops, right? But they're the same thing. It's slave labor. It's below subsistence rates. It's, you know, being kept in locations and locked into work farms and Chinese factories and Vietnamese factories and all of this stuff. And it's still going on. It's still going on all over the world. It's never went away. And even in the United States, when we supposedly fought this Civil War, which is really more about which economic system we were going to buy into, it wasn't really about slavery. Slavery was just a big hassle. Lincoln wasn't even like, you know, an abolitionist. Like, he was, you know, just saw it as like another problem, and then eventually it became the kind of like political, you know, public relations angle that they felt would best like continue this war perpetuating in the States. But it was really about like the industrial economy growing up in the North and them wanting to like keep the Union together, and the South wanting to secede, and Europe wanting to break up the United States into a bunch of different republics that could be more easily manageable, right? So Lincoln frees the slaves, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, and hey, you're free. Well, not really. I mean, you don't have to stay here on the master's farm, but, you know, we're not going to give you a job, and you can't really go anywhere, and you don't have any money, and you don't have any transportation, and, you know, we're not going to, like, you know, like, let you come sit with us. We're going to invent all these other laws. We call it segregation, though. Oh, you are free, but just, you're free over there. You know, we don't want you free here with us. And not really free, you know, what is freedom anyway? And so they created this whole other system where, like, the African American population was still enslaved. Completely. They didn't have any real rights. They couldn't really vote. They couldn't change their situation in the democratic process. They couldn't get decent work. And for 100 years, they lived under, like, pretty brutal segregation. The KKK lynching people left and right, you know, just for looking at a white woman type stuff. Really bad stuff. And then, like, around the 50s, you know, something happened where, like, they drafted all these black guys to go fight in World War II, and these guys are like, why are we fighting for this country? Like, they're not giving us anything. And they had segregated the armed forces up until, like, the early 40s, before Roosevelt desegregated them, you know, because he needed all these extra bodies to go fight the war. And they get out of the war, and now all the middle-class white guys and all the working-class white guys went off to fight. Well, they're coming home and they're getting GI bills and they're going to college and they're buying homes and they're building suburbs for these people, and there's tons of plentiful employment, and the black population comes back and they're kind of screwed. Same thing. And now go back to your segregated lifestyle. Thank you for, defending the country that does not defend you, and now please go back and be a second-class citizen. Well, that started to not work, and they started to wake up. And there was a big movement. It was primarily based in the churches and in the faith-based community that started to really, they looked at what happened in India, and they looked at how Gandhi moved the Indian people into independence through nonviolent means, which, nonviolent just means that only one side's committing the violence. It doesn't mean that everybody sits down and negotiates over tea and crumpets. It's like it's a pretty brutal process to resist nonviolently. They looked at it and they're like, okay, well, a group of them said, well, this is the way we want to go. And another group said, no, screw that. We need to they want to segregate it? Fine. We want to be totally segregated. We want to have our own nation. We want to have our own independence within this country. So there was the black nationalist movement, and then there was the integrationist movement, and these are two different sides of the coin. And they really kind of hold up as general paradigms in the entire consciousness movement. There is one group of people that feel that the subculture, the outside culture, the alienated culture, the subdominant culture, they need to be integrated into the dominant. And you hear it here in this community. Oh, we just need to get to Hollywood and get those people with billions to buy into our thing, and then yeah, we're set. And the counter argument says, well, no, anytime you engage with the dominant culture, you become the dominant culture. That's what it does. It consumes and it assimilates. It's the Borg. Resistance is futile, right? So what ended up happening was this kind of battle in between, but the media really only picked up on the integrationist struggle, because it was we shall overcome, and it was all peace and love, and it was not a threat. And so the government was all great with it, and they elevated Martin Luther King to the status of star, because he was non-threatening. He was preaching love and integration and hand-holding and all kinds of stuff. And his counterpart was Malcolm X, who represented the black nationalist movement and was the progenitor to the Black Panthers and the real militant movement that came out in the 70s after they killed all the black leaders. And what you find out about Malcolm X was that he is portrayed in history as being a demagogue, as being, racist, as hating white people, as calling them blue-eyed devils and all this. But what most people don't understand about him is that he was the first one to really, start breaking the consciousness of the black community. Really start breaking it open. He would speak to them in terms of, you are not free. You are still a slave. Your mind is still enslaved. You still believe yourself as a slave. You look in the mirror and you see yourself as an inferior person. And that slave mentality is what you're taking into your life, and that's why you're taking this segregation. This is why you're accepting this. And so he started breaking down these boundaries. And a couple of the things he found is he went and traveled the world. He went to Mecca. He did his pilgrimage. He found out that the Nation of Islam, the American version of this thing, was just some whacked out creation, just kind of like the Church of Scientology. It has no real basis in anything. And it was a cult of personality around one charismatic leader named Elijah Muhammad. And they were teaching, a very kind of necessary at the time self-sufficiency for the black community. How to dress properly, treat yourself with respect, stay away from the white man's drugs, stay off his food, pray, fast, respect your wife, respect your family. It was the kind of things that were new at the time. And they were very necessary to pull the community together and to teach them a sense of self-respect, a sense of accountability, community responsibility. But as they started to grow as a force, the government was all fine with them just kind of being this weird black nationalist group, because they had this racist thing, and they were easily isolated. They were easily discredited. They were on this end, and the KKK was on this end. And there was one point when Elijah Muhammad brokered a deal between the KKK and the black nationalists, because they found that they actually worked for each other politically, because they didn't want the blacks around, the blacks didn't want them around, and so they figured, we have a common purpose, let's work together politically, okay? Just think about the schizophrenia of that for a second, right? So, when you're forced to get into bed with your enemy because it's better than the person who's supposedly advocating for you in the so-called elected representative government, you've got a problem, right? And so what ends up happening there is that Malcolm goes away. You know, he breaks with the Nation of Islam because he finds that they're corrupt, and that he starts to meet real Muslims. And these real Muslims are like, this is not us. This is not how we go about this. We are a religion of peace. We are a religion of equality. There is no race in Islam. Like, all colors are the same. And so he like comes back and he realizes, wow, like, there isn't just like these black people here. There's black people all over the world, and there's more people of color in the world than there are white people. And if they could only be organized together, wow, we could really change the world overnight. And so that's what he did. He started going around the world to heads of state in all of the Arab and African countries, forming relationships with revolutionaries, forming relationships with friendly governments, and getting the sanctioning of the entire Islamic world, the World Islamic Council, and all of these little, you know, official entities to recognize his group, Muslim Mosque International, as a true, like, Islamic religion, and also conveying the true message, you know, of Muhammad the Prophet, like the real Muhammad, not like the fake Muhammad over here. And so when he started preaching unity, in the sense of unity for common struggle to overturn a ruling order, as opposed to King, who was saying, no, just integrate and let's all get along, you know, Malcolm became a threat, and he was quickly taken out. 2 years later, Martin Luther King had his own epiphany. He realized we shall overcome ain't working, and so he decided to change his tactics, and he started speaking in economic terms. He started saying that this is a poor people's struggle, and he shifted all of his tactics not towards civil rights, but towards economic rights, social rights, a true revolution of the economic and social order. That's why Malcolm X called them Uncle Toms, you know. And a lot of people are like, oh, how could you ever like cast aspersions on Martin Luther King? He was a saint. Well, actually he wasn't, you know. He was a representative of a group that put him up there to be the voice because he was very charismatic. He was a great speaker. He's a brilliant man. And then he finally had his own awakening, and when he started calling for equality, they killed him too. They killed the Kennedys for the same reason. They killed almost all the Black Panther leaders throughout the 70s and 80s. They assassinated, disrupted, destroyed the communities. They flooded them with drugs. They flooded them with guns. They promoted violence, dissension in the ranks. And you could look at what happened to the African American community in Chicago, or I'm sorry, that's Chicago's where I'm from, in the United States, but really like typified by Chicago because it's the most segregated city in the United States. All black South, all white North, all Latin West, right? What there was like a multi-generational, slow-moving cultural genocide. And so like in the 70s, they started fighting back, killing all of the Black Panther leaders. And they divided the whites that wanted to help them, like the Weather Underground, for example, you know? When those guys were looking at what was really coming down on their black brothers, they took off and ran. And then, you know, 10, 12 years later, they came back with their tails between their legs, and they're now all teaching at, you know, high-class universities. And all of the black leaders are gone. You know, the only one that's really left is Mumia, and he's in prison for life. He just got off of death row for being framed for something that he didn't do, all right? And then what ended up happening was that crack and guns flooded through the black communities in the 80s and 90s, and it was like a 30 megaton nuclear warhead hitting them. And, you know, all of this was done because our government wanted to go fight more wars, or I should say the military end of it, and the elected government, the people, refused to fund it. This is in the 80s when we wanted to invade Central America. So just to kind of draw a portrait here of like what the mentality was like, in the early 80s, Oliver North, who was the kind of like stooge behind the whole Iran-Contra Central American War thing, while he was with the National Security Agency, he devised up a series of executive orders that came to be known as Rex 84. And they provided for the internment of political dissidents and for up to 22 million African Americans in the event of a uprising, right? They literally planned to put 22 billion people into detention camps. They were seriously afraid of it. The terror of a black uprising was like paramount in the United States between 1965 and like 1985. During the riots of the 60s, there were 32 major urban riots within 3 years, big ones. And, the ruling class, the ruling order, they have a perspective that most of us don't have. They see back and they have a history for thousands of years. And they've seen multiple civilizations rise and fall, and they just keep passing the information down through each other. So, around the 20th century, when you had the Bolshevik Revolution, that really scared the pants off of them. They really felt like there was going to be popular uprising because people were waking up. People were reading now, and there was this thing called radio, and there was films and things, and information was spreading a lot quicker. And information like Marxism, for example, started to spread around, and people started to see, that there's a potential for a different idea, and then they realized, oh wow, like we're really getting screwed by this system, and the same patterns repeating over and over and over. Okay? All right, so I figure you pretty much got that part. Now, here's how it relates to us. And I may say some things that may rankle you, and I accept that. So I don't mean this to insult us, because we are all part of a community. In fact, it's really meant to talk about how powerful we really are, right? And what we're really up to. And like, I used to, I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in 1970. My parents grew up in the 60s, and they went through that whole consciousness revolution in the 60s, right? And it fell apart. The actual revolution that they were trying to get, which was kind of a socialist overturning of the economic system for more equitable shares of everything, that never happened. There's lots of reasons why it didn't happen, and psychedelic drugs are definitely one of them. If you know the history of how the U.S. Army developed LSD for weaponized warfare, and then realized that it didn't really work to turn people into super soldiers, but gosh, it made them pacifist and really kind of mellow. And just at the brink of the world kind of socialist revolution in 68, when all the countries, all the students around the world are breaking out in massive violent protests everywhere, suddenly Chicago happens, right? The Democratic Convention in 68, suddenly it's all revealed. They're repressing all of these, it's a free speech, it's this and that and the other thing. And so they're looking at like their own revolution, and then suddenly this gigantic like stockpile of LSD that the army was sitting on suddenly just appears everywhere, along with all the other analogs that they made. How many people saw the Woodstock film? Movie about Woodstock, right? Or about the brown acid, don't eat the brown acid. Brown acid is DOB? No, what's it called? BZ, Mark, right? BZ? It's called BZ, yeah. It was a special isolate. It was an analog that they made that kind of brought out like the real dark side, like people's shadow natures. It made them paranoid and terrified and really, really freaked out. And that stuff was like passed around liberally at Woodstock. There was an attempt to destroy the event, to turn it into chaos, which actually ended up happening a little bit after that at Altamont. All right, Altamont, the Manson family, all this stuff. If you really look back into it, like there's connections all up into the intelligence services and the military, and like the attempts to subvert the hippie population. But what ended up happening was like these hippies, sprouted up overnight. It was very much like a politically oriented civil rights, radical socialist revolution, and then boom, overnight it became free. And Woodstock Nation, and check out, and that all grew into the me generation, because LSD can really like mess with the ego. It can make you feel like maybe you're more special than you really are, or something like that. And people who already have kind of narcissistic tendencies, they tend to like get messianic complexes, or just think that they're really important and that like their thing is like the thing, and then it just fostered this whole culture, where they became yuppies and douchebags, and they just went out and made money, and then they bought it, and they bought back into the trap. They said, oh yeah, let's get a house, let's get a mortgage, let's get a car, and not realizing that they were enslaving themselves with every single signature they were making for this thing. They just thought if they got stuff, it would make them feel good about bailing on the revolution when they were 20, So what ended up happening is we all went underground, and then sometime, when the rave era came around, we started popping back up. And then, like, in the last, 10, 12, 15 years, we've really started to explode. There's this global community that is set in these festivals, but its primary base is in spirituality, consciousness, and sustainability, right? Three things the ruling order does not want because it cannot be, you cannot put planned obsolescence into sustainability, so you can't keep selling a new product, right? And when you become conscious of things, you start to become conscious of like how the system works, okay? And so we have all of this assistance through the plant medicines, through psychedelic compounds, through meditation, through yoga, through ancient teachings that are all now being passed around because of this weird thing called the internet that like freed all this information and gave us everything we wanted to know right at our fingertips, where normally we'd have to like travel around and try to find which library had this weird obscure book and could you have access to it, and oh my god, and it was easy to keep people like asleep when you control their information, when you had like 3 channels and you broadcast the same message in green, red, and blue, All right, so I'm going to read you another one. This is by a writer named Carol Moore. And I really like this quote too. Oh, before I get to this, I should just be I don't want to go into this too much because my book's about this, most of my work has been about this. It's really easy to kind of delve into it there. But, the primary tool that the government, particularly in the Western nations, used to disrupt and destroy the political movement was drug laws. See, what happened is in the 60s, as people started becoming more public about their drug use, as the use of psychedelics and marijuana became synonymous with the hippie revolution, and the radicals at the time were all promoting taking acid and dropping out and freaking out, because it was this kind of like petulant, immature rebellion against the parents' generation, and so they wanted, yeah. And it wasn't very mature. There wasn't like elders steering the movement or anything. It was, a very youthful revolution, and most defiant revolutions are like that. And it became easy for the ruling class, and the Nixon in particular, who created the whole drug schedule thing, because he figured it out. He's like, all of these hippies out here protesting in front of the White House, they're all smoking dope. And he's like, we can't round them up because of their political beliefs, we're America, right? But we sure can bust them for drugs, and we sure can persecute their lifestyle. And so that's what ended up happening, was that instead of like trying to get them on their political beliefs, they just started busting people and setting them up for drugs. And this was specifically geared towards the radical community, but then it became an instrument to destroy the African American community. And what they ended up doing over a period of about 30 years was locking up, by some estimates, 35 to 40% of the adult male population. And it's real simple. It's a pattern that they've recognized for years, that if you want to change a civilization, if you want to change a society, just take the one generation of parents away, right? And by the time the second generation is inculcated by the state, they've forgotten or they've turned against their parents' generation, which is what my book goes into great detail about this, looking at the difference in prison between the men of the Vietnam War generation and the kids that are in there now, and what their consciousness levels were versus how they felt about each other. And so now 2 generations of males have been essentially denuded from the African American population. The average life expectancy is somewhere in the early 30s, and it was much lower during the height of the gang wars in the early 90s, the height of the crack wars. So, they lock them all up, and so that takes the males out, and now there's really no strong figureheads, to root the community, so it falls to the women of the community to pick up all of the slack, to be the men and the women, the breadwinners and the raisers, right? And so, to their credit, black women are some of the strongest beings on this planet, and they really deserve, unfathomable amounts of credit for what they've been able to pull off and try to hold together their community. But in effect, there is no more black revolution. There's no more threat of a revolution. There's nothing.
when I was talking to these young kids and I was trying to break down Malcolm X to them and Medgar Evers and MLK and all of the, even Haile Selassie and Bob Marley about what they were really talking about, and I would ask them like, hey, so who is your enemy, And they would, pardon the term, but they would say the nigger down the block is my enemy. I'm always looking over my shoulder waiting for him to take me out. And and I go, well, what about the police? And he's like, yeah, police are definitely my enemy, but not as much as this motherfucker down here. And I'm like, okay, but what do you think about the government? He's like, what? The government doesn't, I don't know nothing about the government. I just know that I got to get food stamps every month because I can't eat. And they don't give us enough, and they put us in these projects, but, how are they my enemy? Oh, okay, so trying to break all that down to them, I tried to explain that, hey, there's this whole system here, and like you're watching all this pop culture, and you're putting on all this bling, and you want to do this whole gangsta thing, and like you're taking all of this money that you're making and you're buying material crap with it, and you're just pissing it all away so that you feel like you got respect in your community. Imagine how much more respect you would get if you took all that money and went and bought a building in your neighborhood.
Fixed it all up. Now you got your own property. And maybe you can help your homies buy other buildings. Maybe you could get a little garden or some shit. Maybe open a shop. And this is like what Malcolm was saying. It was about blacks, self-sufficiency. Okay, jumping back to where we are, boom. Who are we? Well, we're not exactly, an oppressed minority, because most of us, I would venture, come from the middle to upper middle class, if not the wealthy class. This is not exactly a place for, like, poor people. It's not cheap to come here. It's not cheap to travel around the world and put on festivals and go to festivals. So most of us have some affluence, and most of us have some education, and most of us have made a conscious decision to live outside the dominant culture, right? We're dangerous. We are, because we know how to make money, we know how to deal with property, we are entrepreneurial, and we're peaceful, right? And we're also now, more than ever, really, really communicating a strong and profound spiritual message. When I was an activist in the streets and I was getting my head clubbed by the police regularly, I just kept saying, there's something wrong with this here. Like, this is not working. Like, we go into the streets, no one sees what we say. It's like this cacophony of noise. We're completely surrounded by riot police everywhere we go. And then when we actually get to the place that we're supposed to be making the most noise, they come in, they beat the living shit out of us, they tear gas us, they mace us, they run us off. And then we're like, okay, when do we do it again? Yay. It's insanity. It's complete insanity. But I'm sitting there going, well, what do we do? I don't understand, And everybody kept saying, you have to have a spiritual revolution. But what does that mean, spiritual revolution? Like what? Like what? And I didn't really get it. Now I get it. Now I get it completely. And so everyone, the human potential movement, right? Anybody knows what that is? Anybody out there? A couple of you? Wow, you really all should know, because you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the human potential movement. When the 60s collapsed and all of the radicals were burnt out, and they just realized that like mass kind of progressive grassroots change wasn't possible, a lot of the kind of hoi polloi in the psychedelic and spiritual community, like Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd, the guys that founded Esalen, they all kind of were saying, okay, well, this is actually not how we go about it. What we need to do is create new humans. We need to create spiritually evolved humans. They need to develop in themselves, develop their own spirituality, develop their own consciousness. Then as they shift as individuals, they become forces for positive change in the world, and then they start to get more and more and more and more of them. And they went back to the beginnings and went into these tiny little containers and started like transforming people with really, 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 really like cutting edge psychology, techniques, and all things that we kind of take for granted now. How many people go to Landmark Forum? Anybody knows what that is? Okay, yeah, it's a big West Coast cult of like, positive thinking thing. But that all grew out of Esalen too, out of Eckhart's seminar training, and this whole process of like being accountable to a community and a group of people, and having people be able to call you out on your various rackets, as they call it, like the games you play with people to, protect your ego, or not to work in service, or to, whatever the thing is. And they're everywhere now. But what ends up happening is when
when a group becomes conscious is that they become dangerous, okay? So Carol Moore says this: despite the crackdown on drug use, the belief that consciousness is not only the purpose, but perhaps even the very nature of reality, has spread through writings and practices of new physics aficionados, humanistic psychologists, and the New Age, Eastern religion, Wiccan, and eco-spirituality movements. Sound familiar? Right. There are millions of advocates still lack a coherent and motivating philosophical synthesis or organizational focus. And while many of these individuals have used drugs and still do, decriminalization of drugs is not yet a major focus of their thought or action. However, as the horrors of the drug war mount and the injustices spread to all of us, the uneasy feeling that there is some hidden agenda behind the war on drugs grows among more aware and conscious individuals. Some of these agendas are scapegoating drug users for the larger ills, excuses for racial repression and expanding government power, an outlet for militarism, and a desire of tobacco and liquor producers to squash potential competition. However, a prime hidden agenda remains the suppression of an alternate religious view. That consciousness is the nature and purpose of reality. That humans freely create their realities. Because psychoactive drugs are a means of quickly and effectively initiating individuals into this view, they must be suppressed, even if it means punishment, incarceration, and death for hundreds of thousands of people. But such is the nature of all religious wars. Right? There's a reason why all the prophets are burnt at the stake or crucified, you know? They come in and they awaken people, and for that, they are taken out. Because every time somebody comes awake, they realize that the system that exists is no good. So what's going on now? Well, I think it's safe to say that this community has pretty much plugged into the eco challenge. I think everybody here is aware of how fucked up the planet is right now and how much we are responsible for it and how much we have to do to try to change it, right? That part's good. We're solid on that. What people don't really understand now, but what's coming out in huge ways, is what exactly is our relationship, the nature of our relationship to our governments? Who are they? I mean, we're supposed to be democracies, right? Will of the people. How many people, just by a show of hands, think that the world system that we have now is truly a reflection of the will of the people? You do. One person. Tell me why really quick. Just. He's saying the masses haven't said that this is okay. Okay, that's an interesting way to look at it. Because we would think that, okay, if the masses believe something, then they just go out and they vote. And they change things. Well, I don't know about Australia, but where I come from, your vote is, irrelevant. I mean, we have this thing called an electoral college, so really your vote only maybe, kind of maybe counts if you're in a swing state that might go one way between Coke or Pepsi. But ultimately you're just voting in Coke or Pepsi, right? It's all the same. And so why, does nothing ever change? And I don't want to get into an argument about how great Obama is and how awful the other guy was. They're all the same. They're all the same. They follow the same agenda. They have the same paymasters. And the same general principles of society continue regardless of who's in office. It doesn't make a difference. The banks are still supreme, right? The military-industrial complex still keeps chugging forward, finding new countries to invade, rape, and pillage. We have slowly turned America into a police surveillance state. It's really scary what's going on over there, and it's really scary here too. I got off the plane in Melbourne, got picked up by these cats, was going into the city, and the first thing I saw coming out of the airport was a giant checkpoint, right? And it's a Monday afternoon, and there's a huge checkpoint on the highway, and a big, giant van that said drugs across it. And I'm like, is that where we pick up our drugs? This is great. And they're like, no, they're doing checkpoints. They're checking us. I'm like, in the middle of the day for no reason. They're like, yeah, they do it all the time. Don't they do that in the States? And I'm like, well, yeah, kinda. They're doing it a lot more now, but usually in certain areas. And, well, if you're a person of color, of course, you're going to get stopped all the time. But, if you're white, you might be able to get through it and all this stuff. And they're saying, no, they do this regularly. I'm like, so what do they do? And they're like, well, you pull up and you get out of the car and they search the car and then they swab everything and they try to find out if there's any hint of drug use in there. And I'm like, that's insane. Like, what's the point, And they said, well, when you get a driver's license in Australia, you sign away all your rights. And then they said, oh, yeah, by the way, we don't really have rights. We don't have a Bill of Rights here like you guys do in the States. I said, well, we don't really have one either. It's like just a quaint document written on some parchment now, because ever since 9/11, they've essentially eroded everything that we understand as a constitutional protection, and there's some other law in place. And so everybody goes, how can they do that? It's a constitution. Aren't the people supposed to change it? Right. Exactly. So why isn't that happening? Well, maybe because the governments that we're working under aren't really the governments we're supposed to have. Right? I know you're all looking at me like, what is he talking about? Well, how many people understand the concept of the federal state versus the representative republic? Right? Or should I say the federal corporate state? Right? Anybody? Okay, see, this is it. There's like 3 people that raised their hands. And this is the most key integral part of understanding how we can change things. Like, we have to do it together, but the first step is to become conscious of what's happening. And so, first of all, we have to understand that, particularly in the Anglo-American Empire and in the West, the power structure that exists autonomously. In other words, the United States and the federal system that runs it, the federal system that runs the banking system and the financial system in England, the government that runs Australia, the Christian Empire, all come from independent, autonomous, city-state corporations. Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, the City of London, Vatican City, Canberra. These are not parts of the continental United States, the Great Britain, Australia, or Italy, right? They exist independently. And those tiny little federal corporate states, like the United States is a corporation registered in England, right? There was a Pope Boniface in 1300, he came up with this idea, and that's when they created Vatican City and made it independent, so it was not like dependent on any like sovereignty of any other nation, because most of the monarchies and most of the nations that were emerging were built on the notion of sovereignty. Rousseau wrote about this pretty eloquently, although kind of in an arcane sense. But this idea of like, what is the sovereign? Like, where does authority derive from? So for many thousands of years, they said, well, all authority derives from God. It derives from, the Creator, who endowed us with these rights and these freedoms. And so we are sovereign over ourselves. And then, the big battle of freedom that came with the Magna Carta was all about, like, is the monarch absolute sovereign? Like, if they are the God's chosen representative, then, do we really have to give everything to them? And a bunch of people said no. They woke up. They said, no, this guy's no different than us. Like, we have the same rights as the kings, and we demand the same rights back from the kings. And so there was this whole movement. And it's usually always done by the gentry, the lords, the property owners, the rich people, the merchants. And so they were the lords were the one who pushed the Magna Carta to get, their own protections, because they were tired of the king taking all their shit, right? Same thing happened in the United States. It was like the rich landed aristocracy that broke away from the crown, because they wanted to create a system where all of men were created equal, but really only property-owning white men that came from here, but we won't get into that right now. Okay, so in our Anglo-Americo-Australo Empire here, which we're all cousins, we all come from the same progenitor from the British Empire, they have a system, it's called Maritime Admiralty Law. And it is a law that is a law of corporations. It is a law of offshore sea law, navigation law, where there isn't any jurisdiction. And so this type of system has created a corporate state in which each one of you is considered a share in that corporation. So when you are born, you're issued a stock certificate, but it's known as a birth certificate, so that the state officially acknowledges that you're born. And then that number becomes your registration number. And then your government proceeds to calculate, but depending on where your social class is and where you come from and so on and so forth, a average potential lifetime earning. And from that average potential lifetime earning, they then can tax you, right? And so your only function in this system is to serve as collateral for the central bank of your government to borrow against, right? So things like in the United States, the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Reserve Bank and all of these things are completely outside the provisions of the Constitution. They were not provided for in any way. They were not thought of when these people created the Constitution of the United States. What they were thinking of was a government that was self-sufficient. It printed its own money, and it wasn't a debt-based currency. And that everybody got to do their own thing. It was a very libertarian ideal. You know, you buy your property, that's your land, you do your thing, you know, just follow the golden rule, interact with each other peacefully, and everything will be fine. Instead, what ended up happening was this, you know, historical banking empire that had been through many different empires. They came and they kind of set up shop in Europe, and then they eventually started spreading to the rest of the world, creating like a single monetary system that we are on now. And we are about this close away from like a world currency thing. And you see that happening in Europe now because half of Southern Europe's being sold to the International Monetary Fund. They're taking, you know, all of the infrastructure, resources, and everything, and they are piecemealing it off and selling it off to corporations. Again, so this idea of a government is based on a trust agreement, and Max Egan, a guy I got to just hang out with for a couple of weeks, and a really brilliant old guy, he's a filmmaker and a radio host here from Australia, and he does, you know, he's involved in this sovereignty movement and stuff, but what he basically explains is that our relationship with government is a trust agreement, and that, you know, a duly elected government official is really just holding stuff in trust for the people, and that's the way that the constitutions were set up, that's the way we're supposed to be operating. So that when there is a will of the people, they come together and they either amend the Constitution, right, collectively. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. Our governments just pass laws. They're called legislation. But they aren't really laws. They're just the will of the politicians. And so what do we do as a community? Well, how do we preserve this? You know, how do we preserve this amazing space that we've created? You know, how do we not get pushed now farther into the ass ends of civilization, so that maybe instead of crocodiles that we have to contend with, you know, maybe it's like a volcano, like, and we can only like have a festival on the lip of a volcano or something, or, you know, in a swamp, you know, below, or like, you know, I mean, if you think about it, I've been to like 12 festivals this year, and they've been like in extremely remote environments, you know, where they're just, and this is also where they send the Mormons and where they send the Native Americans and anybody who like wants to have autonomy and freedom. They send them to the most godforsaken land where they couldn't possibly support themselves for any long periods of time. And then they're like, okay, you want freedom? Go. You know? The government must have thought it was a hoot when these hippies decided that they wanted to go out in the middle of the Black Rock Desert and build a festival. They're like, you want to pay us to go hang out here? Sure. No problem. They didn't realize like how ingenious we are, you know. I really believe that this community has the chance. We're at that moment. We're at that space now where we really can change things. But we have to know what it is that has to be changed. And I realize that a lot of what I'm saying is, you know, oh, Captain, bring down, be easy, you know, don't smash our bliss bubble. But all you're doing is a disservice to like have that bliss bubble around you in the first place. Because it's not natural for everything to be perfect. It's not. Things are fucked up. And they're also beautiful. They're two sides. Yin, yang, light, dark. Like, it exists, and it exists within all of you, right? There is your light self, there is your dark self, there's your shadow. And that shadow deserves as much space and respect and acknowledgement as the other parts of you. And when you acknowledge it, when you give it space to breathe, then it doesn't act up, it doesn't try to surface and permeate, because it's given respect, it's given breathing room. This whole 2012 thing, man, I gotta tell you, it has been like opening up the darkest recesses of our collective shadows and pouring everything out. Everyone I know went through crisis this year. So many relationships, as far as I could see, were destroyed, ripped apart. People were, together for all the wrong reasons and all the wrong intentions. And they were being driven out of these less savory aspects of their psyche and their being. And so when, the great cosmic forces and father son decides, okay, well, this whole calendar thing's wrapping up and we're all just kind of aligning again, and you guys are in for a ride. Everybody talked about it, yap. Oh, we're gonna ascend, it's gonna be great. Blah. But that isn't what happened. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I grew a lot this year, and I grew a lot because I made a lot of mistakes, and I really, really fucked up my life in a huge way, and I had to really learn from that. I had to go deep into myself and say, what is the nature of Charles? Why did he do this? And that was my own personal journey, and everybody's in a different space here, and some people are much more evolved than me, and some people are just getting started. But I learned a couple things, particularly at this festival, and I'm really grateful for them. And one of them is that, this movement needs all archetypes. It needs all types. It needs everybody. So if some bogan is pissed out of his mind and making an ass out of himself, better that he's doing it here, surrounded by people that can set a better example than a repressive force that's going to just feed him all the booze he wants and then beat the living snot out of him when he steps out of line, right? I came from a very violent background, I can tell. Yeah, thank you. I came from a violent background, I can tell you it doesn't help. Corporal discipline and all of that whole repressive paradigm does not work. Now, it doesn't work either when you give people total freedom, There has to be structure, and we have to structure each other. And so as each of us wakes up and starts to become more conscious of what's going on, and we say, okay, well, you know what? It's not cool that guy left that plastic bottle on the ground, so I'm going to pick it up just because I'm a nice guy, and I realize I have to walk all the way over here to the recycling bin to dump it off, but gosh, am I just going to walk by and see this? I spent most of the early part of the week telling people not to bathe under the drinking water thing, right? And there was this same response. At first they'd be like, ah! What do you mean? No, everybody else is doing it. Where do I get my water? And then they would go, oh, fuck, I wasn't supposed to be doing that. Okay, you're right. I shouldn't be bathing in the drinking water. And I'm like, yeah. Somebody once said, oh, they'll just replace it. Okay, do you see that big tank right there? They have to find the water, truck it in, pay for it, put it in there, right? I do this all the time, so I know how much this shit costs. It's expensive, and it's logistically a pain in the ass. But to just think, oh, well, someone else will do it, it'll just be refilled, is not being conscious of what's going on. It's not understanding where you are, In an intentional gathering like this, we all owe a responsibility to, take care of the place. Over and over again, a very small group of people do all the work. They come out, they prep the land, they build it, they run it, they've got to break it down and strike it, and every year without fail, everybody, boom, disappears. They don't stick around and help. I run this huge art collective at Burning Man. We have hundreds of people in our camp every year, and less than 10 stay behind to clean it all up. And it's a huge production like this. Less than 10 people. Because everyone's got more important things to do. And so, okay, well, great. So, you know what? You guys are all on that part of your journey where you're thinking that what you have to do is more important than what we have to do. And so if we can just some people, we're just going to keep showing up, and we're just going to keep picking up the trash, and we're going to keep building the shit. And you know what? Yeah, maybe you're taking advantage of us. Maybe you're taking advantage of our kindness. Maybe you just don't care. Maybe you just think that we're just here to serve you. Okay, great. You know what? I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me, and I'm doing it for us. I'm doing it because I love this. I'm doing it because it's my way of making something happen. It's my way of contributing. I'm I got a lot of energy. I got to do something with it. Yeah, thanks, man. And so, this culture is precious. I hope you all realize how special this is. This is the last real pockets of true creative expression and freedom left on this planet. And I don't think I'm being hyperbolic in saying that. I mean, again, we have to come to the ass ends of the universe just to set up a party. I mean, like, there's something wrong with that, because if we wanted to throw, if we wanted to have like Nickelback and like 100,000 people and like Budweiser, we could get the stadium right in the middle of the city, and that's okay. It's like drunken, destructive, wasteful bullshit is okay, but sustainable, respectful, peaceful consciousness expansion, big threat, right? So be aware that like there will be repressive forces, even more so against this. I'm here because they believed in what I have to say. They believe in my work, and thank you to Paul and Lisa and Bozke and Emma and Becca and all of them who like put this together, because they really get it, man. Yes, yes, yes. But when my friends tell me, like I opened up in the beginning, and my friends tell me, hey, but listen, we can't advertise you. We are afraid that you will bring the police in and shut this place down. Now, come on, man. I mean, like, I know I can talk and shit, but like, do I really have that kind of power? But when they believe it, perception really is reality, And what it is it's that fear. So, like, really, you're afraid of what I'm talking about? Freedom of speech is scary? Really? And it's true. I mean, I don't hold it against them. I totally understand it. Like, it's not about them. It's about the fact that they were given this message, No subversive stuff. Well, I got news for you people. Everything we're doing is subversive here. Everything. We are subverting the dominant culture. We are flipping it on its head, and we are trying to find a way through it all. And we're doing it, man. We're doing it. I always love the cheap applause, too. That's some of my favorite stuff. It's like, if I just said, like, unicorns, everybody, woo! All right, questions. I'm going to open this up for a little discussion until they kick me off. So, does anybody want to ask a question? Yes.
The outside forces, what about forces you see within this community of consciousness that could also...
Good question. Okay. First of all of you people that have a pathological aversion to bad news need to get over it. Like, you need to get over it. I don't know how else to put it. Like, bad things happen. It's part of the balance of the universe. We cannot have bliss all the time. It's an unnatural state, and you get bored with it. Like, problems exist so that we learn, so that we grow. But also, life is hard. It's a challenge. We're living easier now than anyone in human history has before, and we still bitch about it. And it's like too much. We live in the most affluent corner of society. Like, we have all of the privileges, we have everything, and we still bitch mercilessly about everything. Oh, I gotta wait for 5 minutes for my Portuguese cheeseburger because there's a line. You know what? Fuck it, I'm not gonna eat. And anyway, it's not raw, vegan, organic, special, So the other thing to realize is that, like, also, there is a kind of a prison that exists when you, like, narrow your lifestyle down to just a few things. So, like, if you need, like, all the best raw, vegan, like, organic food, like, you're going to be the first to starve if there's ever an interruption in the food supply. Like, survival means being able to survive under any conditions. If you've weaned yourself into this, like, tiny little box that you can only eat, like, these certain things, you're going to get really sick. It's like about like strengthening everything, like getting inside your soul and like looking at your own problems, because your fears are just being projected onto other people. When you tell them, oh, dark energy, why you got to bring us down, man? That's politics. I don't want to hear that. And like everywhere I go, I see that. That's why, like, there isn't 10,000 people standing in front of me, and I'm not getting paid all the money and have like the VIP, camper trailer and all the drugs and the girls and everything like the DJs do. And that's the other thing. If you really want to do something, bro, all of you guys, shift what is important. Like, take the cultural aspect, the people like me and Mark and a whole bunch of people here that are standing around that are trying to, like, educate people, shift the culture in an intelligent way, and put some value on that. Like, tell the people that there's some value in what we're doing.
I know I'm supposed to be all like evolved and shit, and I'm not supposed to like get angry or anything like that, but it really pisses me off when a 23-year-old kid can make $800,000 pushing a button. I mean, am I the only one who thinks this? Come on, give me a break. I mean, yeah, we like to dance. Yeah, the music's fun. Yes, the ecstatic ritual is a key component of the culture, but still, come on, people, let's get real. Like, my grandmother could do that. It's just a button. Half of them can't spell. So when we put cultural value on things that have no real substance, then it's a reflection, again, of what we're going through, of who we think we are and what we think is important. What's that, sir? Oh, yeah. I can't even think of a more ridiculous construct than professional sports. Like subliterate rapists getting paid millions to like kick a ball around. Thank you. I'll be in Atlantic City on the 15th and Atlanta on the 20th. Try the veal, tip your servers. So that's the other thing, is that shifting, into creating new value systems, like showing interest. Like, it's okay, I think the week festivals are actually much better because you've got all of this time spread out so that people can like, okay, I'm done dancing for a while. I want to go sit and I want to listen to stuff. I want to go in the gallery, and like watch Android paint, or I want to go over here, check out what's going on in this workshop, get a little movement going on. It's like nice, you got space to do it. The really like 3-day weekend festivals is just like, fuck off! And then like, they go for 3 days and then so supporting the arts, supporting the actual people who are creating the art, buying their books and paintings and films and things, that goes a long way.